He said it softly, like he was ashamed even to say it out loud, but not ashamed enough to stop. The words dropped into the silence between us like oil in cold water, refusing to mix, just spreading their thin, shiny layer of humiliation. It was a small dinner at his house, 6 of us around a table that gleamed too much under the white light of some designer lamp. His wife had arranged the cutlery with mathematical precision, the kind of arrangement that warns you not to disturb anything. I had brought a dish I'd spent half the day making, my lentil stew with smoked paprika, the same recipe my mother taught me when I was a girl in Sevilla, back when flavors were allowed to speak louder than appearances. I thought it would remind him of home, of the life before he moved into glass and chrome. Instead, he laughed. "Mom, that smell, it's a bit much. You can't bring that to the table when people are drinking wine." And the others laughed too, polite little chuckles to fill the air while I stood there with my pot, pretending it didn't burn to hold it. I smiled. Of course I did. That's what women my age do when the ground tilts beneath them. We smile, as if politeness could hold up the world. I said something like, "Oh, I suppose it's not fancy enough for company." And everyone laughed again, relieved that I'd made the joke for them. But inside, something fragile shifted. The sound of that laughter wrapped around my chest until I could barely breathe. I took the pot back to the kitchen, scraping the spoon against the bottom, just to have a sound that wasn't them. I poured the stew into smaller bowls, covered them, and slid them into the fridge like hiding evidence of a crime. My daughter-in-law, with her perfect nails and perfect voice, said from the doorway, "Don't take it personally, Elena. David's just trying to modernize our meals." I wanted to tell her that my food had kept that man alive when he had scarlet fever at 7, that I'd spoon-fed him broth through the night until the fever broke, that every bite he'd ever taken in childhood had come from these same hands, but I didn't. I only nodded. Modernize. What a clean word for erasing someone. When I got home later that night, my clothes still carried the scent of cumin and smoke, and for the first time in my life, I felt ashamed of it. My apartment was small, quiet, and the silence was thick enough to hear the pipes breathe. I sat by the window with a cup of water, not tea. I didn't deserve tea that night, that's what I told myself, and stared at the dark street. I thought about all the meals I'd made over 74 years, the soup stirred until midnight, the bread that rose in the warmth of my old kitchen in Cordoba, the taste of salt from tears and sweat mixed together when my husband was alive, and the world still felt like a shared table. Cooking had been my language, my offering, my proof of love, and now it was a reason for mockery. It's a strange thing when your own child teaches you how small you've become in his new world. You start seeing yourself the way they see you, cluttered, outdated, too much. I looked around my kitchen that night, my copper pots, the spice rack with crooked labels, the apron still hanging by the door. And for a moment I saw them through his eyes. Everything looked old. Even I looked old. My reflection in the dark window seemed made of someone else's face, someone whose usefulness had expired. I whispered aloud, maybe he's right. Maybe it's embarrassing. My voice sounded ridiculous, too soft, too sincere for the empty room. I wanted to take it back, but you can't take words back when you've believed them for even a second. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that table, that white tablecloth, the way his hand rested on his wife's, as if to say, "Don't worry, I've managed her." I woke before dawn, went to the kitchen, and opened the refrigerator. The stew sat there in its glass container, thickened from the chill. I spooned some out cold, ate it standing at the counter. It was good. It was better than good. It was mine. But it didn't matter. The taste didn't comfort me. I washed the dish and placed it upside down to dry, and as I did, my hands began to tremble. Not from age, not from weakness, but from the weight of being unseen. That morning, I decided I wouldn't cook for anyone for a while. I told myself it was temporary, that I needed a break, that I was tired of chopping onions for mouths that no longer thanked me. I began buying frozen meals, eating toast, making excuses when my neighbors invited me to bring something to their gatherings. I said my oven was broken. I said I'd lost the touch. They nodded kindly, believing it was arthritis or age. No one suspected it was humiliation. The truth is, something dies in you when your creation, the thing that once built your family, becomes a punchline. Days turned into weeks. The scent of my kitchen changed. It used to smell of garlic and patience. Now it smelled of nothing. The quiet grew thick. I'd wake sometimes at night and imagine the sound of oil sizzling, onions sighing as they softened, and I'd feel a hunger that wasn't about food. It was about being needed, about being seen, but I told myself not to be dramatic. Old women who complain are dismissed twice, once for being old and again for being women. So I said nothing. I just stopped. My son didn't notice. Why would he? He was busy with clients and weekend brunches and vacations that didn't include me. Sometimes he'd call, his voice distracted, telling me about new restaurants, new trends, words like fusion and minimalist cuisine, things that sound clever when you forget what food is for. Once he said, "You should try cooking something lighter, Mom. You'd like it." Lighter, as if nourishment could be weightless. I wanted to tell him that food is memory, that every spice carries a story, that the smell of stew is the smell of survival, but instead I just said, maybe I will. After those calls, I'd walk to the window again and look down at the courtyard. There was an old fig tree there, gnarled and stubborn, still bearing fruit every summer even though no one cared for it. The children from the building plucked the figs too early, leaving them half-ripe and bruised on the pavement, but still the tree kept growing. I used to think I was like that tree, rooted, resilient, but that night I wasn't sure anymore. Maybe I'd become more like the fallen fruit, too early for the world that replaced me. The days stretched, quiet and flavorless, and sometimes I caught myself touching the handles of my pans just to feel something that remembered me. The skin of my hands smelled faintly of steel and pepper, even when I hadn't cooked. I thought about giving the pots away, donating them, freeing the shelves, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not while a small, stubborn ember of defiance still lived somewhere beneath the ache. I didn't know it then, but that dinner, that single sentence, "Your food is embarrassing," was the start of something larger than humiliation. It was the breaking that would make room for something else, something I hadn't known I still possessed, the hunger to reclaim the language of my own hands. But at that moment, I was just a woman standing in her kitchen at dawn, staring at her reflection in the dark window, whispering to the silence, "If love has a taste, then why do they spit it out?" The silence, as always, had no answer, but somewhere beneath it, the faintest spark of rebellion began to simmer. I didn't stir it yet, not then, but it was there, waiting. It happened on a Sunday, one of those gray, restless afternoons when the sky looks tired of itself. I had decided to visit David again, though every instinct in me said not to. I told myself it was because I missed the grandchildren, but the truth was simpler and smaller. I wanted to be seen. I baked a loaf of bread that morning, the kind with a hard crust and a soft center, brushed with olive oil and rosemary. The smell filled the apartment, and for a brief hour I felt almost whole again, as if my kitchen had forgiven me. When I wrapped it in a clean towel and took the bus across town, I tried to convince myself that this was an ordinary gesture, a mother bringing food to her son. But my heart beat too fast for it to be ordinary. When I arrived, Carla opened the door, her expression a mix of surprise and polite disapproval. The house smelled like lemon candles, not food. She said, "Oh, Elena, you should have called. David's working on his presentation." I smiled and said, "Then he'll need something to eat." I handed her the warm loaf, and she took it with the careful fingertips of someone accepting an unwanted gift. She told me they'd already eaten, but she'd put it aside for later. Her words were smooth, but her tone had the brittleness of glass. I stepped inside anyway. The children were in the living room, faces glowing blue from their screens. They looked up briefly, murmured, "Hi, Grandma," and turned back to their games. David appeared at the top of the stairs, laptop in hand, shirt untucked. "Mom, you didn't say you were coming." The warmth in his voice was obligatory, like small talk in a waiting room. "I thought I'd bring some bread," I said. "You always liked it warm." He hesitated, then said, "That's nice, but Carla's trying to cut carbs. You know how it is." He said it lightly, but it landed heavy. I wanted to tell him I didn't know how it is, that food was never the enemy until someone taught it to be. Instead, I nodded, that same old reflex of accommodation. I asked if I could see the baby, and Carla said she was asleep. Everything in that house was asleep. The air smelled of disinfectant and restraint. I sat on the edge of a chair and tried to make small talk about the weather, the traffic, anything. But conversation with them always felt like eating something flavorless, just to prove you could swallow. Then it happened again, almost word for word. Carla asked if I'd seen the new restaurant near the park, and David said, "Yeah, they do that kind of elevated home cooking. You'd like it, Mom. It's what your food was trying to be." My food. Trying to be. He smiled, waiting for me to join the joke, and when I didn't, he laughed softly, the kind of laugh people use when they think they've been too clever to be cruel. "Come on, don't look like that," he added. "You know I love your cooking. It's just heavy. Everyone says so." Everyone. Who was everyone? His new world, his circle of friends who thought butter was a sin and tradition a burden. Carla poured herself another glass of water and said, "We've just been trying to eat cleaner." Cleaner. As if everything I'd ever cooked had been dirty. I remember looking at my hands then, the small scars on my knuckles from decades of knives and hot pans, and thinking that they'd built his whole life, his strength, his bones, the man he had become, and now he looked at them like they were relics. I don't know what I said next, maybe nothing. The silence stretched so long that even Carla started to fidget. Then David tried to soften it, said something like, "Don't take it the wrong way, Mom. You know how sensitive you get about your food." I looked at him and realized I didn't know this man anymore. I knew his childhood laugh, his fevered forehead against my palm, the way he once called me his favorite chef. But this man spoke to me like I was a stranger with outdated tastes. I stood slowly, the room spinning just slightly, not from age, but from the effort of swallowing my pride. I told them I should be going, that I'd forgotten to turn off the iron, an absurd lie, but they didn't question it. Carla said, "Next time call first," and David kissed my cheek in that perfunctory way that means nothing. I walked to the bus stop with the towel still warm from the bread in my hands. I hadn't realized she'd given it back to me. The bus was nearly empty. I sat near the window and watched the city slide by, faceless and fast. My reflection in the glass looked like someone I'd seen in an old photograph, faded, uncertain. I tried not to cry, but one tear escaped, hot and angry, not from heartbreak, but from humiliation. That single word, embarrassing, had stretched itself into every corner of my life, like a stain you can't wash out. I thought of the bread cooling in my lap, its smell still tender and alive, and I suddenly couldn't bear to take it home. When the bus passed a park, I pulled the cord and got off. I walked to a bench under a leafless tree and set the loaf down beside me. The pigeons came quickly, curious and bold. I tore off a piece and threw it to them. They descended in a flurry of gray wings, pecking greedily, fighting for crumbs. For a moment, I envied their simple hunger. A woman walking her dog stopped nearby and said, "Smells amazing. Did you bake that yourself?" I nodded, unsure why her question made my throat ache. "Looks like real bread," she said. "Not that air stuff they sell now." She smiled and walked on, but her words stayed. Real bread. It had been so long since anyone used that word, real, about something I'd made. I sat there for nearly an hour, watching the pigeons, the fading daylight, the ordinary people passing by with groceries and conversations, all of them carrying small, unseen griefs. When the last light went out of the sky, I picked up the remains of the loaf and threw it into the trash. I told myself it didn't matter, but my hands trembled as they let go. That night, the smell of yeast and rosemary still clung to my clothes. I took them off, folded them carefully, and placed them in the laundry basket, as if burying evidence again. I stood by the sink, drinking water straight from the tap, the way I used to when I was too poor for wine, and thought about how love changes shape over time until it no longer fits the people who taught it. My son had outgrown me, or thought he had. He'd replaced warmth with design, flavor with presentation, affection with performance. But somewhere in that space between ridicule and resignation, something began to stir. Not hope exactly, but resistance, the slow, simmering kind that rises from the bottom before anyone notices. I didn't yet know what form it would take. I only knew that I was tired of being quiet about what I had built, tired of apologizing for the language of my own hands. I thought of the pigeons fighting over crumbs of my bread, and I realized that maybe I had been feeding the wrong mouths all these years. I went to bed late, leaving the kitchen light on. The air smelled faintly of yeast, and though it should have made me sad, it didn't. It smelled like something ending, yes, but also like something waiting to begin. In the weeks that followed, the quiet in my apartment grew so thick that it began to hum. I stopped baking entirely. The flour at the back of the cupboard hardened into little clumps, and the olive oil turned cloudy from neglect. Every sound in the kitchen seemed to accuse me. The metallic echo of a spoon dropped into the sink, the small sigh of the refrigerator door closing. I avoided that room except when I had to, and even then, I moved through it quickly, as if afraid of waking a ghost. Food became a transaction rather than an act of care. Sometimes I told myself that it was freedom, that after decades of feeding everyone else, I finally didn't have to. But the truth was colder than that. I had mistaken numbness for independence, silence for peace. On vendors who once greeted me with warmth, now just nodded politely. I had stopped bringing them jars of preserves or plates of empanadas, those little gestures that made me feel part of something living. One morning, while I was inspecting a basket of bruised lemons, I heard someone call my name. It was Ruiz, the neighbor from 2 floors below, her hair tied in a bright scarf, her face lined but lively. She asked where I had been hiding, and when I told her I didn't cook much anymore, she laughed the way only old women can, without cruelty, but with disbelief. "Don't say that, Elena. Some of us wait all week for your pickled peppers. My granddaughter asks for them every Sunday." I shrugged. saying I didn't think people wanted those anymore. But Ruiz just shook her head. People want what feels like home. They just forget until you remind them. She pressed a small coin into my palm and told me to bring a few jars next week. I'll pay in advance. You can't say no now. That evening, I found myself in the kitchen, measuring salt and vinegar by instinct, my hands moving before my mind caught up. The smell rose sharp and alive, cutting through the apartment's stale air. I lined the jars on the counter, the glass catching the light from the small window. For the first time in months, I stayed up late to clean every surface, wiping the counters until they shone, the same way I used to when David was little, and I wanted him to wake to order and comfort. When the peppers cooled, I placed them in neat rows on the table and stared at them as though they were newborns. It wasn't pride exactly, but a recognition of something still unbroken inside me. On Sunday morning, I carried a small basket to the market, wrapped in a towel the way my mother used to carry bread when I was a child. Ruiz was already there, setting up her own stall with crocheted napkins and jars of honey. She waved me over and pointed to a corner of her table. "Put them here," she said. "We'll see if anyone remembers what real food tastes like." I tried to object, but she wouldn't hear of it. "If they don't sell, I'll eat them myself." Then she winked. "But they will." By midday, all the jars were gone. People had asked for more, scribbling their names and numbers on scraps of paper, asking what else I made. When I walked home, the basket was empty, but my chest felt full. I hadn't expected anything to come of it, but the world, it seemed, had a longer memory than my son gave it credit for. Over the next few weeks, I made more jars, then small batches of marmalade, then empanadas for Ruiz's niece's birthday. The rhythm of the kitchen returned slowly, shyly, like a song remembered after years of silence. The walls began to smell again, of sugar, of fruit, of warmth. I found myself humming while I worked, something my husband used to tease me about. "You hum like a kettle," he'd say, always about to boil. I hadn't realized until then how much I'd missed that sound, how it tethered me to myself. But not everything softened. David called one evening, his voice brisk, distracted. He said he'd seen a post on social media. A neighbor of Ruiz's had shared a photo of my jars, tagged me with a caption, "Homemade Magic" by Elena. He said it like a problem. "Mom, what are you doing selling things at the market?" I told him I wasn't really selling, just sharing. "It's not professional, you know," he said. "People can get the wrong impression." I asked, "What impression would that be?" He hesitated, then said, "That you're struggling. I mean, you don't have to do that kind of thing." I wanted to laugh. That kind of thing. As if feeding people were a moral failure. I told him I liked it, that it made me happy. He sighed, that long, patient sigh that children use when they think they're wiser than their parents. "Just don't overdo it, okay?" Carla says it's great you have a hobby. A hobby. He didn't understand that this wasn't a pastime. It was reclamation. But I didn't argue. You can't teach someone to see what they've decided is invisible. After that call, something hardened in me. I realized that his approval was no longer the currency I wanted to live by. I stopped waiting for him to visit. Instead, I started visiting the small community kitchen near the church, helping the volunteers prepare meals for the elderly. The first time I walked in, the air was heavy with garlic and steam, and the women working there greeted me with the warmth of recognition. They didn't ask who I was or why I'd come. They handed me a knife and a pile of onions. By the end of the day, my back ached, my fingers smelled of metal and herbs, and my heart felt lighter than it had in months. The priest came by, tasted one of the stews, and said, "Whoever made this remembers love." I almost cried right there, but I held it in. It was during one of those afternoons that a young woman with bright red hair approached me. She said she was a journalist for a local paper, writing a piece on neighborhood traditions. She'd heard about my pickled peppers and marmalades from the market. "You're kind of famous," she said, smiling. "People say your food tastes like a story they forgot." I laughed, embarrassed, but she asked if she could interview me. The thought terrified me, but Ruiz insisted, "Let her. The world needs to remember we exist." So I agreed. The journalist came to my apartment the next week, her recorder blinking red on the table as I spoke about my mother's kitchen, about feeding my family, about losing the joy and finding it again. She listened without interrupting, her eyes kind. Before leaving, she said, "You know, you have something rare, authenticity." That word rolled around in my head for days. Authentic. I'd been called many things in my life, old-fashioned, stubborn, dramatic, but never authentic. When the article came out, I almost didn't buy the paper. I didn't think anyone would notice. But Ruiz knocked on my door, holding 3 copies, grinning. There I was on the front page of the local section, holding a jar of peppers, the caption reading, "Elena Garcia, cooking from memory." The photo was unflattering, my hair slightly undone, my apron stained, but my eyes were alive. I hadn't seen them look like that in years. By evening, people from the neighborhood began to stop me on the street. They called me Doña Elena, asked about recipes, requested orders. Someone even left a small basket of chilies at my door with a note that read, "For your next batch." The first time David called after the article, his tone was careful, almost forced. "I saw that thing in the paper," he said. "You're really getting attention, huh?" I waited for the rest. "Just be careful, okay? You don't want to overextend yourself. People might take advantage." I thanked him for his concern, but inside I knew he wasn't worried about me. He was worried about what my existence, in this new visible form, might say about him. For him, I had always been background, the invisible scaffolding holding up the life he displayed. Now the scaffolding had stepped into the light, and he didn't know what to do with that. Still, I didn't let his discomfort ruin what I was building. Each morning, I woke with a sense of purpose that felt foreign and familiar all at once. The city seemed less gray. Even my body felt different, steadier. I kept the kitchen window open as I cooked, letting the smell spill out into the street. Sometimes children would stop by the window and ask what I was making, and I'd tell them, "The taste of home." They'd giggle and run off, and I'd smile, knowing that maybe, just maybe, they'd remember it someday when the world tried to tell them that comfort should come in sterile packages. It wasn't a grand transformation, not yet. I was still alone, still carrying the echo of my son's laughter that night at his table, but the echo had dulled. It no longer hurt the way it used to. The silence that followed it was different now, not emptiness, but space. And in that space, something was growing, something that smelled faintly of vinegar and courage. The day everything shifted began without warning, as most quiet revolutions do. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that should have passed unnoticed, except that the air carried a warmth that felt almost like permission. I woke earlier than usual, before the city's noise began, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the familiar heaviness pressing against my ribs. The article had been printed a few weeks before, but its small ripple was still expanding in ways I hadn't expected. Neighbors who had never spoken to me now stopped in the hallway to ask about my recipes. Women my age lingered by my door, offering small gifts, lemons, jars, sugar, little tokens that meant more than they looked. Their gestures were clumsy, but the tenderness was real. I felt something unfolding that was neither fame nor charity, but connection, the kind that once grew around kitchen tables before everyone began eating in silence. That morning, I found a note slipped under my door, written in careful handwriting on lined paper. Community Center requests your participation in our annual food fair. We would be honored if you could demonstrate your traditional recipes. The word honored caught my eye. I wasn't used to being honored for anything, least of all for what I had been told was outdated. My first impulse was to say no. I imagined David's face if he saw me standing behind a folding table in my apron, serving samples like some street vendor. He would be mortified, and the thought made me smile in a small guilty way. But fear quickly followed, fear of exposure, of looking foolish, of failing. I read the letter again, then folded it neatly and placed it on the counter as if postponing a decision could dissolve it. I spent the rest of the day moving around the apartment like a woman being followed by her own uncertainty. I cooked without purpose, only to keep my hands busy. By evening, the smell of onions and paprika filled the air, and I realized I was preparing my lentil stew, the same one my son had mocked months before. The scent was overwhelming, rich and unapologetic. I sat down at the table, tasting it straight from the ladle. It was perfect, exactly as I remembered, yet different too. It no longer carried the weight of proving anything to anyone. It simply existed, a quiet act of persistence. The next morning, I wrote a reply to the invitation in my neatest cursive. I would be delighted to participate. Then I mailed it before I could change my mind. The following weeks were a blur of preparation. The women at the community center were tireless and generous, helping me navigate the paperwork, the logistics, the rules about hygiene and display. They called me Doña Elena, with a respect that startled me. I borrowed large pots from the church kitchen, bought new jars, polished my utensils until they caught the light like old jewelry rediscovered. For the first time in years, I felt the kind of nervous excitement that used to visit me when I was young and in love. Except now, the beloved was not a man, but a part of myself I thought had vanished. The day of the fair arrived on a Saturday that smelled of early spring, the air trembling with the promise of sun. The community hall was a converted gymnasium, its walls lined with tables draped in bright cloths. Each table told a story, tamales wrapped like secrets, empanadas golden and shy, soup simmering in slow rhythm. The noise was soft but steady, the hum of people rediscovering each other through flavor. I set up my corner carefully, arranging small bowls of stew, slices of bread, and little cards with my name written by hand. When the doors opened, people came in waves, families, couples, children with eager eyes. They tasted my food, smiled, asked for seconds. Some closed their eyes as they chewed, and I recognized that look, memory awakening in the mouth. One man, gray-haired and solemn, said, "My mother used to make this. I'd forgotten what it smelled like." I wanted to tell him that I'd forgotten too, until now. By midday, all my food was gone. The organizers insisted I join the demonstration table, where I showed others how to pickle peppers and make marmalade. My hands moved with a confidence that surprised me. The journalist from the local paper appeared again, taking photos, asking questions, promising to feature the event. I should have felt self-conscious, but I didn't. I felt grounded, as though the years of invisibility had not erased me, but distilled me. When the fair ended, they called my name for an award, Best Traditional Dish. I walked to the small stage amid applause that seemed to echo from a life I had almost abandoned. I thanked them, my voice trembling, but steady enough to say, "This is for all the women who who were told their cooking was too heavy, too old, too much. Sometimes too much is exactly what the world needs. The crowd laughed softly, not mockingly, but with warmth. Someone in the front row wiped a tear. Later that evening, I returned home carrying the certificate and a bouquet of wildflowers. The apartment smelled faintly of stew and victory, but not the kind that shouts. It was a private, grounded triumph. I placed the flowers on the table, then sat with a cup of tea, my body aching pleasantly from hours on my feet. I turned on the radio for company, something I hadn't done in months. A local station was covering the fair, and I nearly spilled my tea when I heard my own name mentioned. The highlight of the event was Doña Elena Garcia, whose lentil stew reminded everyone what home tastes like. My eyes filled before I could stop them. I leaned back and let the words wash over me, not as praise, but as validation, the kind that seeps deep enough to heal. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the curtains, I thought of calling David to tell him, but the thought shrank as quickly as it came. I imagined the tone of his voice, half amused, half patronizing, and decided against it. He would find out eventually, and that would be enough. I wanted this moment to belong to me alone. Instead, I called Ruiz, who answered on the first ring and shouted, "I saw you on the news, Señora Celebrity." We both laughed until tears came. She said she was proud of me, but I told her I was just lucky. "No," she said, her voice suddenly soft. "You remembered who you are. That's not luck. That's work." In the days that followed, I noticed how differently people looked at me, not with awe, but with recognition. The man at the grocery store offered to carry my bags. The children in the building asked if I could teach them to cook. Even the woman from the post office, who had never once smiled, told me her grandmother used to make marmalade too. I began keeping a small notebook where I wrote down recipes, thoughts, fragments of stories connected to each dish. It became my quiet rebellion against forgetfulness. One afternoon while writing, I realized I hadn't thought of David or Carla in almost a week. It startled me, this absence of longing. For so long, my worth had depended on their approval, their invitations, their acknowledgement. Now I didn't need any of it. My kitchen had become my world again, and in that world, I was enough. People like David, who build their identities on control, can sense when someone slips beyond their reach. I suspected he would call again soon, not out of concern, but out of curiosity. Yet I no longer feared that conversation. The center of gravity had shifted. I was no longer orbiting his life. I had found my own axis. That week, the community center asked if I would teach a cooking class for beginners. The idea terrified me, but Ruiz nudged me until I agreed. The first session drew only 4 people, a young mother, an older man, recently widowed, a shy teenage girl, and a student with trembling hands. We cooked slowly, messily, laughing at our mistakes. When the stew began to bubble, the room filled with the same scent that once filled my childhood home, and I watched their faces soften. I told them that recipes are not rules, but maps drawn from memory, and that it's okay to get lost sometimes, because that's how you discover your own flavor. They applauded at the end, not for the food, but for the warmth. I walked home that evening with the certainty that I had crossed some invisible border between surviving and living. The shift was quiet, but absolute. The woman who once stood in her kitchen ashamed of her own spices had vanished, replaced by someone who understood that the act of feeding others is not servitude, but power. I didn't yet know that the past would come knocking again, that old wounds have a way of smelling you out when you least expect it. But that night, I allowed myself to rest in the fragile luxury of peace. The kitchen window was open, the air sweet with rain and vinegar, and somewhere deep inside me, a voice whispered, "You've begun again." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly into an envelope that looked too formal for anything good. I found it slipped beneath my door, the return address printed in David's precise handwriting. I stared at it for a long while before opening it, half expecting that familiar tug of guilt to start in my chest, but all I felt was curiosity. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for announcements or condolences. Inside, his tone was careful, almost rehearsed. "Mom, I saw the photos from the community event. You looked happy. I'm glad you found something to do, but I worry you might be overextending yourself. Carla and I think you should slow down. We'd love to talk about how we can help you manage things better." There was more, a paragraph about safety, another about financial responsibility, and one about how proud he was of my little project. At the end, he wrote, "Let's plan a dinner, soon. Carla's parents would love to see you again. Maybe you can bring something light." That last sentence turned the whole thing sour. I folded the letter back into the envelope and left it on the counter, unread a second time. I went about my day as if it hadn't come, but the words clung to me. I could almost hear his voice in them, that mix of control and condescension disguised as concern. He wanted to make sure I stayed in my place, tidy and manageable. It would have angered me once, but now it only saddened me. There was a time when his opinion could unmake me. That time was gone. 2 days later, as I was preparing jars of quince jam for the next market, Ruiz called from the hallway, shouting that a man downstairs was asking for me. I wiped my hands and went to the door, and there he was, David standing on the landing in his suit, holding a paper bag as if it were a shield. He smiled that uncomfortable smile of his, the one he used at parties when he wasn't sure who held the upper hand. "Mom," he said, "I thought I'd surprise you." I told him he had succeeded. He looked around the hallway like he was taking inventory of the building's worth. "You really live here?" he asked. I said I did, and that it suited me fine. He didn't respond. Instead, he offered the paper bag. "I brought croissants from that bakery Carla likes." I thanked him, though the gesture felt transactional. He came inside, and I watched his eyes scan the apartment, the jars stacked neatly, the notebooks, the spice rack bursting with color. He exhaled through his nose, almost imperceptibly. "You've been busy," he said. I told him I had. He sat at the table, opening one of the croissants, then frowned. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know. Selling food, teaching classes. You've worked hard all your life. You should rest. Carla's been saying maybe it's time we talk about long-term arrangements. Maybe a smaller place, closer to us, or..." He hesitated, and I finished for him. "Or a care home." His silence was the answer. I poured him coffee anyway. The bitterness fit the moment. He talked about my health, about my finances, about how he and Carla wanted what was best for me. The whole speech sounded practiced, as though it had been rehearsed in the car on the way over. I listened quietly, letting his words spill into the air without absorbing them. When he finished, I asked, "What is it you're really afraid of, David?" "That I'll embarrass you again?" He looked startled. "What? No, of course not." "Then what?" I pressed. He sighed. "It's just, people are talking. That article, the photos online, some of my colleagues saw them. They asked if my mother was running a food stall. You have to admit, it's not exactly..." He stopped short, searching for a word that wouldn't sound cruel, but it didn't matter. I already knew what he meant. Not respectable, Not modern, not convenient. I stood then, slowly, because if I didn't, I might have shouted. You were raised on that food, I said. You were built from it. Every spoonful was love, even when I had nothing else to give. And now you're ashamed because other people see where you came from? His face flushed. That's not fair, Mom. It's complicated. No, I said quietly. It's very simple. You've mistaken progress for worth. He stood as well, muttering something about not wanting to fight. I told him I wasn't fighting. You came here to save me from myself, I said, but I don't need saving. You do. He stared at me, eyes narrowing, as though trying to recognize the woman in front of him. I don't understand you anymore, he said finally. I smiled without warmth. Then stop trying. He left soon after, forgetting the croissants on the table. The smell of them lingered long after the door closed, sweet and cloying. I threw them away. That evening, Ruiz came by for tea and found me sitting in the half-dark. I told her about the visit, and she laughed, shaking her head. Men like that never change, she said. They only panic when the women they built their lives on stop kneeling. Her words made me laugh too, though it came out as more of a sigh. A week later, the community center asked if I would cater a small event, a gathering for local artists and families. I accepted without hesitation. I wanted to keep moving, to keep creating before doubt could catch up. The kitchen became my sanctuary again, alive with rhythm. I chopped, stirred, tasted, the sounds blending into something close to music. On the morning of the event, I tied my apron, packed my dishes, and walked to the hall with Ruiz by my side. The place was full of color and laughter, the air heavy with the smell of spices and paint. Children ran between tables, women argued gently over recipes, and for once, I felt part of something whole. Halfway through the afternoon, while serving stew to a group of teenagers, I saw her. Carla, standing at the entrance, immaculate as always, holding her phone like a weapon. For a moment, I thought I was imagining her, but no, she waved, small and stiff. The sight of her made the room tilt slightly. I hadn't seen her since that dinner months ago, and part of me had hoped never to. She approached with the same rehearsed smile her husband used. "Elena," she said, her voice light. "What a lovely surprise." I wiped my hands on my apron. "It shouldn't be," I replied. "They invited everyone." She looked around, her eyes darting over the tables and decorations. "It's very festive," she said, the word heavy with polite distaste. "David told me you've been keeping busy." I nodded, waiting for the real reason she'd come. It didn't take long. "We're worried about you," she said. "You've been distant. David says you barely answer his calls." I smiled. He's right. I've been busy living. Her smile faltered. "It's not that we don't support you," she said quickly, "but you have to understand how this looks. The markets, the interviews, it's a bit much." I tilted my head. "Much for whom?" She looked down, fussing with her purse. "People talk. You know how it is. We just don't want anyone to think." Again, she trailed off before finishing, as if the words might poison her tongue. "That your mother is poor?" I asked. "Or old, or human." She sighed, exasperated. "Why do you always twist things?" I wanted to tell her that truth doesn't twist. It only reveals. But instead, I said softly, "You should try the stew." She hesitated, then shook her head. "I already ate." She glanced toward the door. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." "I am," I said. "Better than okay." She looked unconvinced, then reached out to squeeze my arm, a gesture that might have been meant as affection, but landed like pity. "You know we love you," she said. "We just want what's best." I smiled then, not because I believed her, but because I no longer needed to. "What's best," I said, "is finally being myself." She left soon after, her perfume trailing like smoke. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door she'd exited through, the laughter and chatter of the fair swirling around me. Ruiz found me like that and nudged my shoulder. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "just thinking." "About her?" "About how strange it is," I said, "to be pitied for being free." Ruiz chuckled. "Freedom looks like madness to people who've never tasted it." That night, when I got home, I found 3 missed calls from David and 1 voicemail. His voice was tight, rehearsed again. "Mom, Carla said she saw you today. Look, we need to talk. There are things we have to sort out. Please call me." I didn't. Instead, I turned off the phone and lit a candle, the scent of orange peel filling the room. I poured myself a small glass of wine, something I hadn't done in years, and toasted to the silence. It felt like a rebellion. Over the next few weeks, the tension rippled outward. A man in a gray suit came to my building one morning, asking for me by name. He introduced himself as a representative from a financial firm, David's as it turned out. He spoke with rehearsed politeness, offering to help me restructure my accounts for safety and convenience. I told him politely that I handled my own affairs. He smiled the kind of smile that assumes compliance and left his card on the counter. I tore it in half after he left. The calls from David continued, alternating between concern and irritation. "You're being stubborn," he said once. "You can't do this alone." I almost laughed. "I've done everything alone," I told him. "You just never noticed." Eventually, I stopped answering altogether. I knew it wouldn't stop him, but I needed the quiet. Then one evening, as I was finishing a batch of marmalade, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't David. It was the journalist. She told me she'd received a request from someone claiming to be my son, asking for copies of my interviews and photos for a family archive. She found it strange and wanted to let me know. I thanked her, though my stomach turned. It wasn't an archive he wanted. It was control. I realized then that he wasn't just embarrassed. He was angry. Angry that I had built something he couldn't claim credit for, something beyond his understanding. That night, I lay awake, thinking about all the ways mothers are taught to shrink so their children can grow. We give them our energy, our time, our silence, until one day they mistake it for entitlement. I thought of my kitchen, my jars, the hands that had rebuilt a life from nothing, and I made a promise to myself. No one would take that from me again. The following morning, I went to the bank and opened a small account separate from everything tied to David. I deposited what little I had earned from the markets, and when the teller asked if I wanted to name a beneficiary, I said no. It felt almost scandalous, that word. No. So simple, so final. Walking out into the sunlight, I felt taller, steadier. Ruiz met me for lunch, and when I told her what I'd done, she raised her glass of lemonade. "To know," she said, "the most powerful word we have." The world outside hadn't changed, but I had. And though I knew there would be consequences, David's persistence, Carla's worry, perhaps even more letters, I was no longer afraid of their disapproval. I had learned something vital. When people can't own your joy, they try to rename it as recklessness. Let them. I had my jars, my students, my recipes, and the slow, unhurried rhythm of a life that finally belonged to me. What I didn't know then was that freedom has its own gravity, and once you step into it, everything that once held you tries to pull you back. The next call would not come from David, nor from the journalist, but from someone far more unexpected, carrying news that would force me to choose between silence and voice once and for all. It began with a phone call from the community center, a woman's voice trembling slightly as she told me that the Regional Cultural Committee had chosen my name for the annual culinary showcase. She explained that every year they selected a few home cooks whose recipes represented the heritage of our region, and someone had nominated me. My first reaction was laughter, soft but disbelieving. Me, a woman who once cried over an empty kitchen, now asked to stand among professionals. The woman continued speaking, telling me that it was an important event, that the press would be there, that I could demonstrate any dish I wished. I thanked her, my hands gripping the receiver too tightly. After hanging up, I sat for a long time in silence. I knew this was what all the months of cooking and teaching had been leading toward, yet the thought of stepping into that light filled me with a strange mix of exhilaration and dread. I tried to imagine David's face if he heard of it, the tight smile, the discomfort disguised as amusement, and I realized that for once, it didn't matter. This wasn't about him anymore. The following days were filled with preparations that felt like both a ritual and a test. I cleaned the kitchen until the counters gleamed, polished the pots, ironed the old apron I had worn when my husband was still alive. I chose my dish without hesitation, the lentil stew, the same one that had begun everything, the same one that had been mocked and rejected, the one that carried my entire history in its quiet simplicity. Every ingredient had meaning: garlic for endurance, paprika for courage, lentils for humble abundance. I wrote notes in the margins of my recipe book, small reminders to myself: stir slowly, taste often, trust the memory of your hands. The morning of the showcase, I woke before dawn, nerves coiling like thread beneath my skin. The air outside was cool, and as I stepped into the street carrying my pots and baskets, I felt both ancient and new. The hall was vast, filled with the clatter of pans and the murmur of anticipation. But then I saw Ruiz in the crowd, waving with both hands, her grin wide and unashamed. I took a deep breath, straightened my apron, and began. As the stew simmered, people drifted toward my table, drawn by the aroma. I told them that every meal was a conversation between what we have and what we hope for. They listened, not politely, but earnestly, the way people do when they recognize truth, even if they can't name it. Someone asked if I had family helping me, and I smiled. No, I said, but I have a kitchen that remembers me. The crowd laughed gently, and the tension that had clung to me all morning melted. The judges moved through the hall with clipboards and cameras, tasting and nodding, their expressions unreadable. When they reached my table, I served them small bowls, careful not to spill. One of them, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes, tasted a spoonful and closed her eyes. "It tastes like my grandmother's kitchen," she said softly. I'd forgotten what that felt like. The others murmured in agreement. They thanked me and moved on, but I saw something settle in their faces, a memory rekindled. I didn't need a trophy. That moment was enough. As the event drew to a close, the organizers called everyone to the stage for the awards. I stood in the back, content to watch, not expecting anything. But when the announcer said my name, clear and deliberate, the room seemed to fall away for a heartbeat. "For preserving the soul of our culinary tradition," he said, "we present this year's honor to Doña Elena Garcia." Applause rose around me, warm and honest. I walked to the stage, my knees trembling slightly, and took the small plaque they offered. The lights were bright, and beyond them I saw faces, some smiling, some curious, And then, unexpectedly, one that froze me where I stood. David was there, standing near the back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. I didn't know how long he had been watching, but the sight of him didn't undo me the way I might have feared. If anything, it steadied me. I turned back to the microphone, my voice low but clear. "Thank you," I said. "I accept this not as a chef, but as a woman who learned that the recipes we inherit are not just about food, they're about survival, memory, and the refusal to disappear. This stew was once called embarrassing. Today, it stands for every mother who ever fed love to people who forgot its taste." The applause came again, louder this time, not polite but heartfelt. I saw David lower his head, whether in shame or reflection, I couldn't tell. After the ceremony, people crowded around to congratulate me, to ask for photos and recipes. Ruiz appeared at my side, her eyes shining with tears. "You did it," she whispered. "You turned their shame into gold." I laughed softly, still dazed, and hugged her tight. When the crowd thinned, I saw David lingering by the doorway. He approached slowly, hands in his pockets, looking smaller than I remembered. "Mom," he began, his voice uneven, "I didn't expect—" I spared him the effort. "I know," I said. "You didn't expect me to still be standing." He smiled faintly, but his eyes glistened. "You were amazing," he said, almost whispering. "The food, it was like being a kid again." For a moment, silence stretched between us, thick but not hostile. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't understand." I studied him, the lines of his face, the weariness in his posture. I thought about all the years I had given to making him comfortable, the decades of shrinking so he could expand. Part of me wanted to forgive him instantly, to fold him into my arms and pretend that time could be rewound. But the wiser part knew that forgiveness, if it came, would have to grow slowly, like dough left to rise. "Understanding comes late sometimes," I said, "but at least it comes." He nodded, eyes fixed on the plaque in my hand. "You really deserve this," he said. "You've built something incredible." I looked down at it, the modest wooden base, the engraved letters already beginning to smudge under my fingerprints, and realized it wasn't the award that mattered, but what it represented, the reclaiming of my own narrative. He offered to drive me home, and for once I accepted. The car ride was quiet, filled with unspoken things. As we passed through the streets, I noticed how the evening light softened everything, the storefronts, the faces, even his profile. When we reached my building, he didn't rush to leave. He turned to me and said, "I'd like the kids to taste your stew. They should know where they come from." The words were simple, but they struck deep. I nodded. "They will," I said, "when they're ready." He smiled, and for a fleeting second, he looked like the boy who once stood on a stool to help me stir the pot. After he left, I carried the plaque upstairs, placed it on the kitchen counter beside the jar of dried herbs, and stood for a long while in the fading light. The kitchen was warm from the afternoon sun, filled with the scent of lentils and victory. I opened the window, letting in the sound of the city, and for the first time in years, I felt completely still. The shame that had once haunted this room had dissolved into something richer, a quiet pride, heavy but sweet. I poured myself a glass of water and toasted the empty space. Later, as I cleaned up, I found one of David's forgotten croissants from months ago, wrapped in its paper bag at the back of a drawer, hardened and stale. I held it in my hand for a moment, then threw it into the trash with a smile. Some things are not meant to be revived. I sat at the table, the plaque catching the last glint of evening, and thought of all the women like me, those who had been silenced, dismissed, underestimated. I wished they could have stood there with me in that hall of noise and light and felt what it was like to reclaim your own flavor. When night finally settled, I made one last pot of stew, not for anyone else, not even for Ruiz, but for myself. The scent filled the apartment, wrapping around me like an old, forgiving embrace. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, each memory, each small defiance that had led me here. Outside, the city pulsed with distant music and laughter, but inside, all was calm. I thought of my mother, of my husband, of the generations of women who had taught love through labor, and I whispered to them, "We did it." They remember us now. The pot sat empty by the end, but the room felt full. I looked around at the walls, the jars, the worn wooden spoon resting beside the sink, and felt something close to holiness. The journey that began with humiliation had led me here, not to fame or wealth, but to wholeness. I understood now that triumph doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simmers quietly, steady and unending, like a stew left to keep warm long after the guests have gone. The days that followed were slower, softer, as if time itself had decided to let me breathe. The air in the apartment seemed lighter, no longer heavy with ghosts of old arguments or the ache of things unsaid. The plaque from the showcase still sat on the counter, gathering a fine layer of flour dust, because I refused to treat it like something precious. It belonged there, among the jars and spices and little signs of ordinary life, not on a shelf pretending to be sacred. I woke earlier now, not because of loneliness or habit, but because I wanted to. There was a calm rhythm to my mornings, the kettle singing, the windows opening to the smell of bread from the bakery below, the faint echo of the world waking up. I had lived long enough to know that peace is not silence. It is the sound of your own breath returning home. David called again after a week, his voice softer than before. He said the children had seen a clip of me from the event on social media. They were fascinated, he said, asking questions about when he was small, what I used to cook, what the house smelled like. He asked if they could visit on Sunday to have lunch with me, and I said yes, though I didn't rush to plan the menu. I wanted to see what the day would bring. When Sunday came, the knock on the door was tentative. The children ran in first, full of bright noise, filling the room with the chaos that used to frighten me, and now felt like life returning. David followed, carrying flowers instead of criticism, and Carla came too, her smile tight but genuine enough. I had made lentil stew again. It seemed right that the story that began with that dish should find its quiet ending there. The smell greeted them before I did. Carla hesitated for a moment, then said, "It smells wonderful." And for once, I believed she meant it. We ate together at my small table, elbows bumping, spoons clinking. The children asked if I was famous, and I told them I was only old, which is a different kind of fame. They laughed, and I laughed with them. David didn't speak much, but I caught him looking at me several times, as if measuring the distance between who I was and who I had become. When the meal was over, he insisted on washing the dishes. I wanted to refuse, but I let him. It felt symbolic somehow, his hands in my sink, rinsing away the traces of what had once divided us. After they left, the apartment was quiet again, but it was a good quiet, the kind that holds warmth rather than absence. I sat at the table, the bowl still damp from washing, and thought about how life has a strange way of circling back. For so long, I believed my worth depended on being needed, and when I wasn't, I thought I had disappeared. But now I understood that invisibility had only been a cocoon. The woman who emerged wasn't new. She was simply unhidden. There's a difference. Ruiz came by later with her usual noise, bringing a jar of honey and gossip about the next fair. She wanted to know if I would participate again, and I told her maybe, but that I was tired of competing. "What would you do instead?" she asked. I smiled. "Teach," I said. "Not recipes, resilience." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. Before leaving, she said, "You know, Elena, I think the best revenge against time is not pretending to be young, but staying curious." I laughed. Then I must be immortal. That night, I wrote a letter to myself, something I hadn't done since I was a girl. I wrote it on thick paper with my best handwriting and sealed it inside an old recipe book. The letter was simple. You did not disappear. You transformed. You learned that love can survive without approval, that dignity is quiet, and that sometimes the things that embarrass others are the things that will save you. Never stop feeding the parts of you that refuse to die. I placed the book back on the shelf, not for anyone else to find, but to remind myself that stories don't always end, they simmer. The following week, I began a new ritual. Every Friday, I left a small pot of stew or a loaf of bread on the table in the building's lobby, a gift for whoever needed it most. Sometimes it vanished within minutes. Sometimes it sat there until evening, its warmth fading, but its intention intact. No one knew it was me, though I suspect Ruiz did. It wasn't charity. It was conversation, the kind that doesn't require words. I like to imagine that each bite carried a trace of my laughter, a whisper of my defiance, a reminder that comfort, when shared, multiplies. The seasons began to turn again. The light changed, softening against the walls. I found new students for my classes, people of all ages, some lonely, some curious, some simply hungry for something more than food. Teaching them filled the spaces that used to ache. I watched their hands learn the rhythm of kneading, the patience of stirring, the humility of waiting for flavors to unfold. I told them that every recipe has two ingredients that can't be bought, time and tenderness. They wrote that down like scripture, though I never meant it to sound wise. I was only telling them what life had taught me. Sometimes, late at night, I stand by the window and look out at the courtyard where the fig tree still grows. It bears fewer fruits now, but they are sweeter, richer, as if the tree itself has learned restraint. I think about all the years I spent trying to prune myself to fit into other people's expectations, and how absurd that was. We are not meant to be ornamental. We are meant to feed. I touch the glass, watching the reflection of my hands in the window, hands that once trembled with shame, now steady, stained with saffron and survival. When I go to bed, I leave a pot on the stove with enough stew for the next day. The scent fills the apartment through the night, seeping into my dreams. Sometimes I dream of my mother stirring her own pot, smiling at me with that calm certainty of women who know that care is a form of rebellion. Sometimes I dream of David as a boy, his cheeks flushed from the steam, saying, "More, Mama, please." In those dreams, I always give him more. I don't pretend that everything has healed perfectly. There are still moments when the old ache returns, when I remember the laughter at that dinner table and feel its echo. But it no longer wounds, it reminds. Pain, when faced long enough, turns into wisdom, and wisdom is a quiet companion. I live simply now, but with intention. Every dish I cook, every jar I seal, every student I teach is a small declaration that I exist, and that existing well is its own form of victory. Before going to sleep, I sometimes whisper into the stillness, not a prayer, but a kind of benediction. Feed those who stay. Let the rest eat their pride. The words make me smile each time, not bitterly, but with peace, because I finally understand that the true feast of life isn't shared with those who mock your table. It's shared with those who arrive hungry and leave grateful. And if that sounds like forgiveness, perhaps it is, though it's the kind that asks for nothing in return. The last thing I see before closing my eyes is the soft glow from the kitchen door, the faint reflection of the pot on the stove, the slow, steady rhythm of something still cooking. I think of it as my heartbeat turned into sound, and in that warmth, in that small, enduring light, I know I've come home at last.